I think it is important to recognize that it's impossible to talk about CETA without TTIP, and it's impossible to talk about Canada and or the United States without making reference to NAFTA, and that brings into the mental mind map also Mexico. The country Mexico is never mentioned in connection with the transatlantic trade agreements, but we all know that through NAFTA there will be disciplines domino going on. At the same time, there's also on the European side a very complicated relationship between the European Union and the member states. And I hope to explore that a little bit with you. CETA, in the minds of some people, is simply a pilot that was negotiated in order to test what could be done with the United States. The assumption was that whatever was discussed with the Canadians would find its way into the reports to Washington, so it was a proxy negotiation with Washington. It isn't officially like that, but the assumption is that there is enough transparency in the process so that this would be a useful process to find out what might be a possibility to agree with the United States. For others, it is more the blueprint. This is settling down between the European Union and Canada, the foundations, the structure, much of the content that would then become de facto the normative blueprint for any subsequent agreement, including TTIP. In that sense, you negotiate with the nice people and then you impose the result on the people that are more difficult, called the Southern Canadians. Anyway, the process of CETA, as with TTIP, has spoiled a little bit the reception. People in Europe do not like trade agreements, even though they don't know what stands in them, because there was opposition to CETA and there is opposition to TTIP, even though the texts haven't been published and not enough has been leaked to actually make a judgment. CETA is now publicly available since September last year, so people read and people run their models of what it might mean. But on the way there, a lot of goodwill that may have been had has been lost because of the lack of transparency in the whole process. And so some people, having learned their reflexes with earlier international agreements on investor protection, have learned to mistrust the trade policy community and the trade negotiators to the point that they form an opinion today without actually reading what the agreement says in the first instance. Now, the text of CETA has been published on the 26th of September 2014. Canada at the 2013 was the EU's 12th most important trading partner. Most of that trade is in industrial products, over 90% both ways. The rest, less than 10%, is mostly agricultural produce and a little bit of fish. So most of the trade negotiations are about industrial products. CETA would essentially eliminate all the tariffs, most of them, 99%, 98% immediately, and another little bit over a period of 7 years, and the exemptions or the extensions until the tariffs are completely cut fall predominantly onto the agriculture and the fish side, where there are a number of special arrangements. But the weight really is there. CETA is, if you go to a trade negotiator's jamboree and you ask them what they want, and they write you their Christmas wish list, everything that they would write on there is in CETA. So it deals with principle of national treatment, no discrimination anymore, market access rights, the bans on restrictions on imports and exports, rules of origin, rules on subsidies, removal of technical barriers to trade, mutual recognition, mutual acceptance, conformity assessments, reciprocal, in order to make sure that licensing work only has to be done once in one country, trade and services, including financial services, labor mobility, competition policy, state enterprises, public procurement, strong also on intellectual property right protection, including geographic indications of origin, copyright, all of that strong language, strong regulatory intent that is visible in the text, and the investor-state dispute settlement. There There are also a number of chapters that have weaker language. They are the restatement of measures or permission to take measures in the area of sanitary and phytosanitary protection of health, plant health, human health, animal health, basically by referring to existing agreements. So there's nothing surprising in there. It has a chapter on sustainable development. That's a novelty, but as sustainable development is a fuzzy concept, the chapter itself can also not be very specific. There is a reflection, let's say, on trade and environment and trade and labor standards. All of that is weak. So it's very strong on the traditional agenda of the trade policy community, and it is very weak language in all the other areas that environmentalists may care about. But the problem is really about this transparency. So far, everything has been negotiated behind closed doors, and then there is an agreement that is settled, hundreds of pages long, and parliaments and the publics on both sides of the Atlantic have to accept it as it comes out of the negotiation process, and no iota should be changed. And it goes on like that. If you look at the processes that are going to be established for future mutual information about legislative projects, all of that is similarly behind closed doors, similarly opaque. Parliament is only informed after the American trade negotiator has been informed about a legislative proposal in one of the member states. That at least is the plan. So you can see that there is a clash of cultures between the trade policy community that wants to do everything behind closed doors, wants to do the package deals, and then when they're finished, then present them to those who feel that it's their right to make the rules, parliaments, and to the publics to take a view on that. If you look at CETA, and the same is true also for TTIP, it's quite obvious that it has the positive intention of stimulating trade, stimulating growth, stimulating employment. If that happens by collateral damage, so to speak, carbon emissions are going to go up. Unless there is compensating structural change, which can also be facilitated by CETA and by TTIP, more trade, more economic activity will mean more emissions. But that is marginal, and I, as a personally, would not complain about that. There is the growth, there is the additional transport that comes in. There are also things about specific energy trade, energy product trade. Oil exports from North America directly, shale gas, shale oil, but also oil derived from, we call them tar sands, you call them oil sands. The LNG exports from the United States, another energy trade. There are two types of emissions coming out of that. It's the carbon dioxide that is embedded in the products and that will be released when the product is used, combusted as it is meant to be. And there are also the methane leakage that happens specifically in the production of natural gas, including the liquefaction, the regasification. All of those things lose energy and they produce opportunities for methane leakage. I mentioned tar sands and the link to the European Fuel Quality Directive, a beautiful conflict between Canada and the European Commission, where the European Commission really stands on the side of the Canadian government rather than the parliaments of the member states. It's really strange to see a realliance of the actors. And it alerts us to the fact that this is not something where we have a conflict between Canada and the European Union or between Canada and the US against the European Union. This is really a conflict that pits corporations against legislators, technocrats, bureaucrats in the public administration against publics. So the positions, if you take the positions of the environmental movement on both sides of the Atlantic, they're very similar. Talk to the people in the labor movement, their positions are very similar. Talk to the business people, their positions are very similar. So it's the conflict is not nations against nations, it's really different components of our societies against one another. The CETA and TTIP could, and in my view should, also facilitate trade in green energy, goods and services, environmental goods and services. Some of them, some electrical goods going to the United States, I'm not quite sure what it is like with Canada, have up to 23% tariffs still on them. eliminating them would reduce the cost of pursuing policies for transforming the energy systems. And there are a number of other examples where we can see potential benefits, and I'll come back to that. The fear by the critics is that not only you have these negative impacts of more growth and more emissions and accelerated energy trade that then leads to higher emissions, but that there is also the risk of a regulatory freeze with TTIP and CETA in place, specifically with the investment protection or investor protection clauses in there, that it will become more difficult politically but also legally to maintain or to adopt new policies that protect public goods, environmental protection, health protection, consumer protection, or other such things. There is this pre-notification thing. Imagine that. And this comes from the TTIP discussion, not so much the CETA discussion. In the TTIP discussion, what the European Commission has proposed is that any legislative proposal coming out of its own services or from one of the member states having been notified to the Commission services in the European Commission would then be notified to the American trade negotiators so that they can have a view on whether this would affect their interests or not. And then they will be informed, and then they can ask for corrections in the language or perhaps even ask for the proposal not to be taken forward, even before the publics or the parliaments in Europe have known about that. This is such a violation to the principles of open government, specifically in the Scandinavian countries. It's difficult to see how the European publics and parliaments are going to accept that. There are additional tests, if you like. Whenever new legislation is proposed, it has to be tested whether it imposes barriers to trade and investment, whether it is discriminatory against certain countries, against certain technologies, against certain businesses that may have a high market share, whether it is burdensome, a diffuse term that needs interpreting, and whether in some cases it may actually reduce the profitability of existing investments or planned investments to the point that the investors can claim that it was a regulatory taking, a taking of profit, a taking of assets by regulation. This is not the same as expropriation, not taking things out of the ownership of people and transferring the ownership into government. It's not nationalization, but it is reducing the profitability or the value of assets indirectly through regulation. So this is the fear that there will be a freeze. And there is the fear that there is a moral hazard in the sense that if countries learn that you can suppress legislation by claiming that it is burdensome on your industry or that it may be discriminatory, then it creates an expectation on behalf of the legislators or in the minds of legislators that you cannot legislate something that under normal circumstances you could. It's also, our political systems have discontinuities. We sometimes elect one government and then the next election the color changes. And it has happened in the past that one of the office holders was, let's say, lacking in consideration for the public interest, and that they gave away something that they shouldn't have given away. Once that has happened, the subsequent government can only correct that mistake against the payment of compensation to the investors. We had that example on the fuel directive, the threat of Canada not moving forward in other areas actually persuaded the European Commission to drop demands or tests for the quality of fuel, including production standards that otherwise they might have adopted. So, what's the impact of CETA and TTIP on climate and energy policy? You guessed a lot of things behind the lines of what I said before. So, would CETA and TTIP force the abolition of existing rules? No, that's unlikely to happen. Would it frustrate future policy measures? Yes, most likely. Would it impact current debates and decisions? Yes, that is already happening. It is happening not only in the Fuel Quality Directive, I've said that 3 times now, that's enough. It's also happening on the sustainability criteria for the production of wood pellets. It's an important trade between the United States and the European Union. Again, we are already anticipating, and the looming TTIP and the disciplines there are having an impact on the European policy debate. Would it oblige the partners, Canada and the European Union, the US and the European Union, to adopt effective climate protection policies? Forget it. CETA and TTIP could say something in a chapter about abolishing all subsidies and privileges for fossil energy, for nuclear energy. That would be easy to do, but it doesn't. Something that would be eminently useful is excluded from that agreement. So on the whole, I think that it's very difficult to find positive things from an environmental and climate perspective to defend CETA and TTIP. And I'm personally very sorry about this, because I believe that trade facilitation is very good and that unnecessary barriers to trade should be abolished wherever they are. And I do see that there are a lot of positive things that could be had through CETA and TTIP, but I fear we will not have them. We will not have them because of the issue of investor protection. The investor-to-state dispute settlement, that is something that is very complicated. And in the CETA agreement, it has been developed in a much more positive way, much more transparent way, much better way than we have it in pre-existing international agreements. Lots of bilateral agreements have investor protection, and CETA is a very positive development from those starting points, but it falls still far short from what, in my view, would be acceptable to the publics in Europe, not just in Germany, but in every country in the European Union. The trade negotiators in the 90s have concluded 2 multilateral agreements on investor protection, MAI and the MIA. Just the 2 letters were changed around. Both of them failed ultimately because parliaments refused to sign away their successors' rights to legislate. And that is going to happen again. I see no fundamental learning process in the trade policy community amongst trade negotiators. They again made the mistake of negotiating everything behind closed doors, running roughshod over the legislators, the parliamentarians, whose assent they need at the end. They have burned the bridges that would have been there. They could have had a transparent process. They chose not to. And they have created something that may be better than the investor protection that was agreed in the 1990s, but it's still not acceptable. And what I fear is that because people stick to this rule that once the package has been agreed and CETA has been finalized and is published, and once TTIP comes out of the negotiating process and everybody has signed on to it, and then it has to be adopted as it is. It cannot be discussed and changed. A discussion with parliamentarians only makes sense if they can shape something. They don't want to be informed about something that they cannot change and then asked for assent. So I fear that as a result of the investor protection, both CETA and TTIP will falter together. They will go under together. And my advice to the trade negotiators and the governments on both sides of the Atlantic is to look at both of those agreements, mentally take the investor protection out and look at the rest of it and see whether it is balanced and whether it is agreeable to all sides. Hopefully it is, because there is a lot of good stuff under the trade facilitation of those agreements, which we would lose if the whole thing falters on the investor protection. If, however, that cannot be done, either because the trade policy community is unwilling to unravel the package, or because even after unraveling it, the whole thing is politically burned to the point that it is unacceptable, the plan B has to be to go with all the benefits that we want to have and pursue them through other fora. The environmental goods agreement, the government procurement agreement, separate processes on energy trade under the International Energy Charter. There are lots of other fora through which the positive things can be pursued, either bilaterally or even better multilaterally. And that's the plan B, prepared to take the whole agenda to the other fora in order to save what is good. And I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion we can have now. Thank you.